The morning air in the small Colorado town was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of pine and distant snow from the mountains. People knew him well, the elderly man who often passed through Main Street with a steady but unhurried step. His name was Harold, and even at 78, his back was straight and his spirit seemed unshaken by age. He was not wealthy, not famous, and not someone who sought attention, but he was remembered for his kindness. He always greeted strangers with a smile, bought children candy at the local store, and carried a leather-bound journal wherever he went. In that journal, he wrote about trails, plants, and little thoughts that came to his mind as he wandered into the wild. For most of his life, Harold had lived quietly, but whispers in town suggested he had once been a soldier. Some older residents recalled his medals being displayed during a parade many years ago. He never spoke much about those days. Instead, he often talked about the Rockies, the range he had loved since boyhood. "The mountains hold secrets," he would say, tapping his notebook with a gentle smile. To him, every ridge was a story, every river a song, and every hike was like returning home. On one bright morning in late spring, Harold packed his old canvas backpack. Inside went a canteen, some dried food, a folded map, and of course, his journal. He left a note on his kitchen table that simply said, "Going up the North Trail, back before sundown." His neighbor saw him walking toward the base of the mountains, steady but sure, his walking stick clicking against the gravel road. It seemed like any other day, just another of Harold's countless hikes. But this one was different. He never came back. At first, no one was alarmed. Harold often took longer routes if he found something interesting. Sometimes he would return at dawn the next day with a smile, saying he had fallen asleep under the stars. Yet when night passed and then another day came with no sign of him, concern spread quickly. His family, though small, began to panic. Neighbors joined together, calling the rangers. A search was launched across the rugged slopes. The Rockies are beautiful, but they are also merciless. The trails twist and climb, weather shifts without warning, and shadows hide sudden drops. The rangers combed through canyons and ridges with dogs, helicopters scanned from above, and volunteers spread out with lanterns at night. They found signs of Harold's presence at first. His footprints were spotted near a clearing, his walking stick discovered leaning against a fallen tree close to a cliffside. But the trail grew cold after that. It was as if the mountain had swallowed him whole. The community was shaken. Harold was not just another hiker, he was part of their town's rhythm. Children who once waved to him on the street asked their parents why he had not come back. His small house, filled with books, old maps, and stacks of journals, became a place of sorrow for those who entered it. Rangers assured everyone they were doing all they could, but after weeks of searching, the official mission was reduced. The mountains, they said, were too vast. Without new evidence, there was little hope. Still, stories began to spread. Some said he must have slipped into a ravine, his body hidden in places no one could reach. Others whispered darker tales that Harold had seen something he should not have. There were rumors of caves used by strangers, or of old military secrets hidden in the Rockies. No one could prove any of it, but the absence of answers left space for fear. His family clung to hope, even as the months dragged on. His niece, Sarah, refused to believe he was gone without trace. She visited his house often, reading through his journals. In them, she found notes about wildlife, sketches of plants, and reflections on life. But in the last few pages, Harold had written something unusual: voices by the ridge. Not hikers. Moving at night. The words were underlined twice. Sarah showed the rangers, but they dismissed it as the musings of an old man. To them, Harold was simply lost, and the mystery would fade with time. Yet the town never forgot. His story became a kind of ghost tale told around campfires. Hikers whispered about the man who went into the Rockies and never returned. They said the mountains kept him, that his spirit wandered the ridges at dusk. Children dared each other to follow his trail, though most never did. 2 years passed. New hikers came and went, and seasons changed, covering the trails with snow and then with green again. But the name Harold was still spoken in the town. His journals, preserved by his niece, remained a reminder of a man who loved the wilderness more than anything. Some believed he had simply found his final rest among the peaks he cherished. Others felt uneasy, as if there was more to the story, something hidden deep within the forest that no one had yet uncovered. The rangers themselves carried a quiet weight. Though they had searched tirelessly, many felt they had failed him. Some spoke privately of strange signs they had seen during the search: ropes cut cleanly, ground disturbed in odd ways, and an old piece of camouflage cloth tucked under leaves. It did not match Harold's belongings, and at the time, they had brushed it aside. But in the back of their minds, questions lingered. Was Harold really alone in those woods? Even as the official files gathered dust, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The cliffs, the rivers, the dense trees all stood as silent witnesses to what had happened. No answers had come, only shadows and uncertainty. Yet somewhere in the Rockies, beyond the marked trails, the truth waited, hidden beneath moss and stone, in places where few dared to tread. And while the town went on with its life, the mystery of Harold's disappearance remained like an unhealed wound. People still looked up at the mountains on quiet evenings, watching the sun slip behind jagged peaks. They wondered if Harold was out there still, if his footsteps echoed on forgotten paths, or if the forest itself had chosen to guard his secret. The Rockies had claimed many lives before, but this time, it felt different. This time, the silence was not just of nature, but of something more deliberate, something human. And though no one could yet prove it, the story of Harold was only beginning. 2 years had passed since Harold had gone missing in the Rockies, yet the memory of his disappearance still lived in the small town like an echo that would not fade. Time had changed many things: children grew taller, new families moved into town, and tourists continued to visit the mountains during the summer months. But every time locals walked past Harold's small wooden house at the edge of town, they felt a sense of emptiness. The windows were now covered in dust, the garden overgrown, and the wind chimes by the porch no longer rang because the strings had snapped. His niece, Sarah, still kept the key, and sometimes she entered quietly, sitting in the silence as though waiting for her uncle to walk back in with his journal in hand. Sarah had never accepted the explanation that Harold had simply wandered too far, slipped, and vanished. She had read his journals more times than she could count, and certain passages disturbed her deeply. His careful handwriting had described things she could not explain: footprints on trails at night, voices echoing where no hikers should have been, and the feeling that he was being watched. He had underlined those words as if he knew they mattered. Rangers had looked at the journal when she first brought it forward, but they had told her gently that Harold was old, perhaps tired, and maybe his mind had been playing tricks on him. She did not believe that. Her uncle had been sharp and strong, not someone who confused reality with imagination. The town, too, carried unease. Hunters who ventured into the deeper forest reported strange signs. A man named Carl, who knew the Rockies better than most, told anyone who would listen that he had found a rope stretched across a trail at ankle height, almost invisible in the brush. At first he thought it was left behind by careless campers, but then he realized it was tied deliberately between two trees. Another hunter swore he had seen dug-out pits covered with branches, though he avoided them out of fear. No one could explain why such things would exist in those woods, but people whispered that Harold's disappearance and those strange discoveries were somehow linked. Rangers, for their part, tried to remain logical. Nature was dangerous enough on its own without adding mystery to it. Still, some of them remembered their search for Harold and how odd it had been. They remembered his walking stick found near the cliff, as if placed there on purpose rather than dropped in panic. They remembered seeing patches of earth disturbed in ways that did not seem natural. One ranger, still young and fairly new at the time, recalled finding scraps of cloth deep in the undergrowth. It was green and brown, a kind of camouflage material. He had kept silent then, unsure if it meant anything. But 2 years later, it still lingered in his memory. The forest itself seemed to breathe with secrets. Tourists stuck to the well-marked trails, snapping photos of waterfalls and feeding chipmunks by the roadside. But locals who had lived near the Rockies all their lives knew there were places the maps did not cover, valleys and ravines where shadows fell too quickly, and clearings where the silence seemed heavy. It was in those forgotten places that people felt Harold's story was written, a story unfinished and unsettling. Sarah, restless and determined, began to hike the same paths her uncle had taken. At first, she was afraid. She carried a whistle, a flashlight, and sometimes even hiked with friends. But over time, she grew more confident. She knew her uncle's notes by heart, and she tried to trace them with care. One day, while climbing near the ridge where his footprints had last been seen, she noticed something odd. Beneath a thick layer of moss and pine needles lay a piece of metal, rusted but clearly shaped. It looked like part of a container, perhaps military in design. She picked it up and carried it home. The rangers she showed it to were polite, but again they dismissed it. Old scrap, maybe from a camp decades ago, they told her. But in Sarah's heart, it felt connected. Meanwhile, hikers reported more odd things. A group of college students who had camped overnight claimed they heard metallic sounds, like tools striking stone, somewhere in the darkness. When they shined their lights, they saw nothing, yet the noise continued. Another hiker said he found fresh-cut branches arranged in a pattern across a clearing, as though someone had tried to build a wall or a barricade. None of it could be confirmed, but the stories kept coming, weaving together a sense that something or someone had been active deep in those woods long after Harold vanished. For the rangers, the mystery was frustrating. Their duty was to protect both people and the land, yet they could not ignore that these rumors unsettled visitors. Some rangers began to quietly investigate during their off-duty hikes. One of them, a man named Daniel, walked further into a canyon than most dared to go. There, he noticed a line of rocks placed deliberately, each one flat on top as if marking a boundary. He also saw tree bark stripped in straight lines, not by animals but by a sharp blade. It gave him chills, and though he took photos, the images only showed ordinary trees to others. Still, he knew it was not natural. As months turned into years, the unanswered questions grew heavier. Why would Harold leave his walking stick behind? Why did his journals mention people moving in the forest at night? And who could have built traps in a place where hikers should have been safe? No one wanted to say it openly, but more than a few suspected that Harold had stumbled upon something dangerous, perhaps people who did not want to be found. If that were true, it explained why he had never returned. The town held on to fragments of hope. A few believed Harold might still be alive, living in some hidden cabin, surviving as he once had during his younger days. Others thought that if he had died, there should at least be signs, bones, clothing, something. But there was nothing, and that was the strangest part of all. It was as if he had disappeared into the very earth. One winter night, Sarah stood at her uncle's porch, staring at the dark outline of the mountains. Snow fell softly, and the silence was thick. She thought of him out there, the man who had raised her after her parents passed away. She thought of his steady voice telling her never to fear the unknown. Yet now the unknown was all that remained. She promised herself she would not give up, even if it took the rest of her life to understand what had happened. By the second anniversary of his disappearance, the Rangers organized a small memorial hike. They gathered townspeople and walked part of the North Trail, leaving flowers near the place his walking stick had been found. The ceremony was simple, but beneath the surface it carried unease. People whispered again about the rope traps, the dugout pits, and the odd noises in the forest. Rangers nodded quietly, unable to deny what they themselves had seen. The Rockies still stood tall and unmoved, their peaks glowing pink under the setting sun, but for those who lived in their shadow, the mountains no longer felt the same. They seemed alive with hidden eyes, holding back answers no one could reach. And while tourists came and went with smiling photographs, the locals carried with them the heavy truth: Harold's story was not over. Something in those woods had happened. Something was still there. And sooner or later, the mountains would reveal it. The summer sun hung low over the Rockies, turning the slopes gold, when the Rangers decided to push deeper than they ever had before. For 2 years they had followed rumors, listened to hikers' stories, and studied Harold's journals, but nothing concrete had surfaced. Some Rangers argued that it was pointless, that Harold was gone and nothing more could be done. Yet others, especially Daniel, felt a pull toward the truth. He remembered the strange markings, the stripped bark, and the carefully placed stones he had once seen. They did not feel like the random acts of nature. They felt like signs left by someone who knew what they were doing. That morning, a small team of 5 Rangers strapped on their packs. They carried ropes, food, radios, and maps, though the area they planned to enter had no clear trail. Sarah had pleaded to join them, but they gently refused. The terrain was too harsh, the risks too real. She stood by the ranger station as they left, her eyes full of both fear and hope. She told them quietly, "If you find something, anything, please bring it back. I need to know." They promised they would. The hike was long and rough. The deeper they went, the less sound there was, as if the forest itself did not wish to reveal its secrets. Branches clawed at their arms, and the ground rose sharply, forcing them to climb. Hours passed before they saw anything unusual. Then, near a narrow ravine, one ranger paused. Something metallic glinted under the dirt. They dug with their hands until a rusted canteen appeared, dented but intact. The initials H.W. were scratched faintly on the side. All of them froze. Those were Harold's initials. The air felt heavier after that. They continued with sharper eyes, every shadow suspect, every broken twig a sign. Only a short distance further, they found scraps of fabric tangled in a thorn bush. The cloth was faded, but the pattern was unmistakable, the muted greens and browns of camouflage. It did not match the hiking clothes Harold had worn, and it seemed odd for any modern hiker. Someone had once worn this deliberately to blend into the forest. They pressed on, moving cautiously now. The terrain grew stranger, as though human hands had disturbed it. Large branches had been cut and stacked, though not for firewood. Some were arranged into shapes, leaning against each other. The Rangers examined them, puzzled. "Could be shelters," one murmured. "Or signals," Daniel suggested. None of them were sure. Then came the moment that shook them. At the base of a slope, half hidden by ferns, lay a crude but deadly trap. 2 logs had been tied together with old rope, sharpened to points at one end. They had been rigged to swing downward if someone disturbed the trigger line. The rope was frayed with age, but the design was unmistakable. It was a booby trap. The team stood in silence, the forest around them still and watchful. One ranger whispered, "This wasn't built by accident." Another said, "Who even knows how to build something like this?" Daniel crouched close, examining the knots. They were tight, clean, and efficient, the work of someone with training. His throat went dry as he thought of Harold's past. Harold had been a soldier once. He would have known how to do this. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Had Harold built the trap to defend himself? If so, from what? Or had someone else set it, and Harold had stumbled into their territory? Either way, it was clear, Harold's disappearance was no longer a simple hiking accident. They marked the site carefully and continued, hearts pounding. Not far away, they found another sign. A narrow pit, dug into the earth, covered with sticks and leaves. It looked shallow now, but if someone had stepped there 2 years ago, it could have meant a broken ankle or worse. More than one ranger felt a chill. Whoever made these had intended to harm or at least stop intruders. As the sun began to sink, shadows stretched across the forest, and the team decided to set up camp. That night, gathered around a small fire, they spoke in low voices. No one laughed, no one relaxed. The discovery of the traps had changed everything. Daniel studied the canteen with Harold's initials, holding it close to the light. "He was here," he whispered. "There's no doubt now." The others nodded. But the bigger question remained, what had happened to him after that? Sleep did not come easily. Every sound of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the crack of a branch made them sit up, alert. They felt as if they were being watched. One ranger admitted he dreamed of Harold that night, standing silently in the trees with his journal pressed to his chest. When dawn came, they rose quickly, eager to search further. The second day brought even more evidence. They stumbled upon a half-collapsed lean-to shelter, built of branches and bark. It was small, just enough for one man. Inside, they found old food wrappers and a torn page from a notebook. The writing had faded from rain and time, but a few words were still legible: "Not safe, follow," that was all. The rangers stared at the page, shaken. If this had been Harold's, it was proof that he had survived for some time after he vanished. The forest seemed endless, but now it felt like they were walking through a maze someone had built. Traps, shelters, and odd arrangements of stones marked their path. Each discovery brought them closer to the truth, yet also deeper into danger. One false step, one missed rope, and they could suffer the same fate Harold had. The realization weighed on them heavily. By the time they returned to town, their packs carried more than supplies. They carried evidence: the canteen, the fabric, the notebook page, and photographs of the traps. Sarah met them at the station, her eyes wide with hope and dread. When Daniel handed her the canteen, her hand trembled. She pressed it to her chest, whispering, "He was alive. He was really out there." Tears filled her eyes, but she stood straighter than ever. For her, this was not the end, it was only the beginning of finally knowing what had happened. The rangers filed their report, careful and detailed. They could not deny what they had found: Harold had left signs of survival, and the forest contained dangerous, deliberate traps. It was no longer a matter of a missing hiker. Something else had been in those mountains, something that had forced a 78-year-old man to draw on his old skills to protect himself. The story spread quickly through the town, and soon beyond it. Newspapers picked it up: missing elderly hikers' belongings found in Rockies, and rangers discover traps in remote forest. Some reporters painted Harold as a tragic hero, a veteran fighting unseen enemies in his final days. Others speculated about hidden groups living in the mountains, protecting secrets no one had uncovered. The truth remained hidden, but one thing was certain: Harold's disappearance was no longer a closed case. That night, Sarah placed the canteen on Harold's desk, next to his journals. She lit a candle and sat in the quiet, reading his words once more. This time, every sentence seemed sharper, more urgent. She felt that her uncle had been trying to tell her something all along, something no one had wanted to believe. And now the rangers had proof that he had not imagined it. He had lived it. The mountains outside stood as silent as ever, but to those who knew the story, they no longer seemed peaceful. They seemed guarded, like a fortress hiding what had really happened. And deep within, beyond the trails and the rivers, the forest kept its silence, holding back the rest of the truth. The news of the canteen, the scrap of fabric, and the crude traps spread quickly. What had once been a quiet mystery of an old man who never came back from his hike was now something darker, something that made people lower their voices when they spoke about the mountains. Harold was no longer remembered only as a kind elderly man who loved nature. Now he was a symbol of unanswered questions, of a past that seemed to reach out from the shadows of the Rockies. The Rangers could not leave it there. Their discovery demanded answers. They returned to their reports, their maps, and the old journals that Sarah had shared. The more they studied, the clearer it became, Harold's disappearance was connected to more than a simple accident. He had been careful in his notes, almost as if he knew someone might need them later. His words about voices at night and not safe near the ridge no longer seemed like the imagination of an old man. They looked like warnings. Sarah herself pushed them to go further. She spent nights reading through the notebooks, highlighting passages where Harold hinted at being followed or watched. She went to the ranger station often, sitting with Daniel and the others, showing them her uncle's handwriting. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a line that read, "They move in silence, not hikers, not campers." She underlined the words with her finger. He knew something was wrong. "You have to believe him." Daniel believed her. He had seen the traps. He had touched the canteen with Harold's initials. There was no doubt in his mind now. The investigation began to shift toward Harold's past. Older residents of the town remembered bits and pieces. Harold had been a soldier, yes, but more than that, he had been trained in survival. During his years in service, he had been sent on missions into forests and jungles where few others could survive. He never bragged about it, but people who had served alongside him once described him as calm, clever, and unshakable when faced with danger. Some even said he could disappear into the trees and reappear miles away without being seen. If anyone could live off the land, even at his age, it was Harold. This new knowledge changed how the Rangers saw the traps. They were not random accidents or cruel jokes. They were the deliberate work of a man who had known how to defend himself. But from what? That was the question no one could answer. Some thought maybe Harold had feared animals, though the traps seemed too advanced for that. Others whispered about hidden criminals, smugglers, poachers, or even men with darker business in the mountains. If Harold had stumbled across them, he might have tried to protect himself. To find out more, the Rangers went deeper than before. Daniel led a new team, carefully retracing the areas near where the first trap had been found. They moved slowly, always scanning the ground, the trees, and the shadows. It did not take long before they found more signs. Another pit lay hidden under fresh leaves, deeper and more dangerous than the last. A few yards beyond that, they discovered sharpened stakes placed upright in the earth, carefully concealed. One ranger muttered, "This isn't random. This is a perimeter." Daniel agreed. It looked like Harold or someone else had been building defenses. Then came the most chilling discovery. Near a cluster of rocks, they found what looked like a small camp. The remains of a fire pit lay cold, ringed with stones. Ashes and charred wood told them it had burned once, though years had passed. Beside it, under a half-buried tarp, they uncovered a box. Inside were tin cans, some empty, some unopened, rusted but intact. And at the bottom, wrapped in plastic, was another piece of Harold's journal. The writing was weak, the pencil faded, but they could still make out his words. "They are close. I can hear them. Must keep watch." The Rangers looked at each other in silence. The entry was short, but it spoke volumes. Harold had survived long enough to write those words. He had known he was not alone. And he had been afraid. News of the discovery hit the town hard. Some felt sorrow, picturing the old man struggling alone in the forest, setting traps and listening for footsteps that were not his own. Others felt fear, realizing that whoever or whatever had been near Harold might still be out there. Sarah, though heartbroken, clung to the journal page as proof that her uncle had not simply faded away. He had fought to the end. He had left his mark. The Rangers pressed on with their search, though each step grew heavier. They began to notice patterns in the traps. They were not scattered randomly. They seemed to form lines, as if marking a boundary. Perhaps Harold had tried to fence off an area, creating a zone of safety. Or perhaps he had tried to keep someone else from reaching a place he wanted to protect. Either way, the forest no longer seemed wild. It seemed mapped, planned, and shaped by human hands. Theories multiplied. Some suggested Harold had stumbled upon a group hiding illegal weapons or supplies. Others thought he might have discovered old military stockpiles left from training exercises decades ago. A few, the most superstitious, whispered of secret communities in the mountains, people who lived away from the world and guarded their land with silence. None of it could be proven, but the traps gave every rumor weight. The search team found more evidence as days passed. In one hollow tree, they found a length of rope, coiled tightly and still strong. In another clearing, they found stones stacked to form a lookout point, giving a clear view of the valley below. These were not the works of chance. They were the signs of someone who had known strategy, who had built a network of survival in the heart of the forest. Sarah visited the site one day, escorted by Daniel and 2 rangers. When she saw the traps, the shelter, and the journal page, she fell to her knees. Tears streamed down her face, but she smiled through them. He was strong, she whispered. He fought. He didn't just vanish. For her, the forest was no longer a place of silence. It was a place where her uncle's spirit had lingered, where his skills and courage had left their mark. But for the rangers, the discoveries only deepened the mystery. If Harold had built the traps, why had no one ever found his body? If he had fought to protect himself, who or what had he been fighting against? And why had the forest seemed to swallow all evidence of that struggle? The mountains stood quiet, their peaks gleaming white against the blue sky, but beneath the calm surface lay questions no one could answer. Harold's story was no longer just about one man lost in the woods. It had become a story about secrets buried deep in the Rockies, secrets that hinted at danger, survival, and a fight no one had ever seen. The rangers returned to town with heavy hearts, carrying the journal page and their notes. They knew the search could not stop. Something was still hidden out there. Harold's traps had been warnings, and though years had passed, the warning felt alive even now. The decision to go back into the forest one more time was not taken lightly. The rangers had already found Harold's canteen, scraps of camouflage fabric, traps built with skill, and even a torn page from his journal. Every discovery had deepened the mystery instead of solving it. Yet there was a sense among them that the forest still held the final piece of Harold's story, something hidden far beyond the trails most people ever walked. Daniel gathered a small team again, this time with more supplies, better mapping equipment, and the determination to push farther than before. The plan was simple but dangerous: follow the line of traps deeper into the Rockies, map them carefully, and see where they led. Sarah begged to join them, but Daniel shook his head. "If we find what I think we'll find," he told her, "it won't be safe. But I promise you, if there's anything left of him, his words, his belongings, you'll have them." She nodded, trusting him, though her eyes showed how hard it was to stay behind. The team began their journey early, moving with caution. Every few yards they checked the ground, the branches, and the shadows for hidden dangers. The traps were old now, weakened by weather, but they were still sharp enough to remind them of the skill behind them. Each one seemed to be part of a pattern, leading them deeper into the heart of the forest. It was almost as if Harold had built a path, not to keep others out, but to lead someone to something. Hours passed, the air growing cooler as they climbed higher. Then, near a grove of pines, they spotted something unusual. A circle of rocks formed a kind of boundary, and within it lay another structure. This one was different from the lean-to they had found earlier. It was sturdier, though half-collapsed, made from thick branches woven together with rope. It looked like Harold's last attempt at shelter. The rangers approached slowly, their breaths quiet, as if stepping into sacred ground. Inside, under the broken roof, they found scattered items. A rusted knife, a small pile of bones from meals long finished, and scraps of clothing too faded to recognize. But what caught their eyes was a pouch, carefully wrapped in plastic and wedged into the corner of the shelter where rain could not reach it. With steady hands, Daniel pulled it free. Inside lay Harold's journal, worn but intact. The leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed, yet his handwriting remained clear. The Rangers gathered close as Daniel turned the fragile pages. At first, they read his familiar notes about the forest plants, streams, the weather. But then the entries changed. His words grew shorter, sharper, filled with tension. Saw them again last night. They know I'm here. Setting traps to slow them. The Rangers exchanged uneasy looks. Who was Harold writing about? Deeper into the journal, the words revealed even more. Not lost. I followed them. Strange equipment. Not hikers. Not rangers. The writing trembled in places, as if his hands had been weak. If anyone finds this, know I tried to stop them. Too old to fight, but I will make it hard for them. The final pages grew faint, but one line stood out, written with shaky determination, the mountain will tell the truth one day. I did what I could. The Rangers sat in silence, the weight of Harold's final words pressing on them. The forest around them seemed to listen too, as if the trees themselves remembered his struggle. Daniel closed the journal gently, his voice low. He wasn't just lost. He was trying to protect something or stop someone. They searched the shelter more thoroughly, finding a few more signs of Harold's fight for survival. A pile of sharpened sticks leaned against the wall, ready for use. A rope snare was set up nearby, though broken now. Even at 78, Harold had used every skill he had to build defenses. He had lasted longer than anyone thought possible. But in the end, his strength had given out. The Rangers marked the site on their maps, then prepared to leave. They knew they could not carry everything down, but the journal was carefully placed in Daniel's pack. The climb back to town was long, but the weight of the pouch seemed heavier than all their gear. It carried not just words, but the voice of a man who had fought to the very end. When they returned, Sarah was waiting. She rushed forward as soon as she saw Daniel holding the journal. Her hands shook as she opened it, eyes scanning the pages, tears falling as she read her uncle's last thoughts. He wasn't weak, she whispered. He wasn't confused. He knew what he was doing. She pressed the journal to her chest, her voice trembling. He fought for something none of us understood. The town gathered that evening at the community hall. The Rangers shared what they had found, showing the journal to those who wanted to see it. Some gasped at Harold's words, others fell into quiet thought. Theories began again: smugglers, secret operations, people hiding in the Rockies for reasons unknown. But one thing everyone agreed on: Harold had not simply vanished into the forest. He had left behind proof of a hidden battle. In the weeks that followed, the site of Harold's last shelter was visited by more Rangers, carefully studied and documented. Officials debated what to do next, but the deeper areas of the forest remained closed to the public. Too dangerous, they said. Too unstable. Yet whispers spread among the locals that the truth was still out there, buried beneath the silence of the mountains. For Sarah, the journal was both painful and comforting. She read it every night, tracing her uncle's handwriting with her fingers. His words gave her courage. He had faced fear but had not given in. He had used every skill he had, even as an old man, to survive and protect himself. His story became not just a tale of loss, but of strength. As autumn settled over the Rockies, painting the trees in shades of fire and gold, the memory of Harold's fight lingered. Hikers still came, tourists still snapped photos, but the locals walked the trails with a new respect. They knew the mountains were not only beautiful, they were keepers of secrets. And somewhere deep in those forests, hidden among the ridges and shadows, Harold's traps still remained. Old, weathered, and silent, they stood as reminders of a man who had refused to give up. Though his body was never found, his story had been written into the land itself. His journal, his traps, and the silence of the forest told the truth. Harold had not been just an elderly hiker who vanished. He had been a soldier to the very end, guarding secrets that perhaps only the mountains would ever fully understand. The Rockies kept their silence, but those who knew the story carried it in their hearts. And when the wind swept through the pines at night, it seemed almost as if Harold's spirit still walked there, steady and unbroken, watching over the trails he had loved.